Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'm going to be painting frosty berries with a bokeh background. This will be my first time painting bokeh effect and I tried to figure out the technique along the way, so hopefully the process makes sense for you guys. Before I start this painting though, I just want to make sure I mask the sides properly so I can have clear edges. Since the main subject will be the frosty berries, I'm just going to draw out a couple of branches. I drew them out diagonally even though it's still curved and textured. Just feel like this diagonal line will bring a little bit more movement and dynamic to the composition. On either side of the branches, I'm just going to draw simple leaf outlines as well as oval berries. By the way, I'm not really using a reference here, so I'm not even sure what berries these are, so I just drew oval ones. But if you have a specific one in mind or you have a favorite berry plant, you can also play around with the shape and the color of the berries. The only thing that I want to point out here is to make sure you pay a little bit of attention to the angle of the leaves. Even if you only include one or two leaves which are not facing straight forwards, this will really help with the composition and also with the clumps or formation of the berries where some are in front of the other, because this will greatly help with a more natural composition if you're not going to use a reference image. But don't worry, for those of you who don't want to draw at all, I'll still have the outline available in my coffee shop. Lastly, for the sketch, I'm just going to double up the lines for the branches to make it a little bit thicker. And before I start to paint, I just want to mask everything that I just drew out. This will make the bokeh effect so much easier to paint later on. I'm using this masking fluid by Marie's and I really like the pointy tip it has to make easier application, especially for the branches. But as for the leaves and the berries, I was trying to figure out a way to even out the coating, especially around the edges. I tried to use a needle to move the masking fluid right to the edge without putting too much pressure, because I also used this needle to poke out some air bubbles. But it took too long and it felt like it was a bit dangerous since I might poke and damage the paper along the way. At this point, I also wasn't sure whether I want to just mask off the outline or the larger elements completely. So for some of the leaves, you'll see me just placing the masking fluid around the edges. But then I realized that this will also hinder from the process of painting the bokeh effect, since I will be painting with many layers, and to avoid painting on so many areas will just be a hassle at this point. But along the way, I remembered that I have these silicone brushes to spread masking fluid, and I must say it's so much easier and safer to use than the needles, and it was also very easy to clean, so I guess this will be one of my go-to art supplies for now. And it was also very easy to pick up some of the masking fluid that I've already applied, then use whatever is attached to the silicone tip to draw or paint on the smaller branches. This is not necessary though, since the branches will be painted with a really dark value, but I just wanted to test the application with these silicone tips. You want to make sure that the masking fluid is completely dry before we start to paint, and meanwhile let me go over the colors. Winsor Red by Winsor & Newton, New Gamboge by Daniel Smith, Payne's Grey Bluish by Schmincke, Sepia by Holbein, and Bleedproof White by Dr. P.H. Martens. So let's begin to paint. Unfortunately, my masking fluid wasn't completely dry yet, but I was running out of daylight, so I really need to get this done. Most of the masking fluid is dry though, it's just some of the midsections, so I am being just a little bit more careful while applying the water since I don't want to disrupt the wet masking fluid in the middle. If yours is 100% dry though, of course you can use a bigger brush to just dampen the whole surface without applying the water as carefully as what I'm doing here. What I'm trying to get is a more or less even damp surface, and I want to leave a little bit of time until the paint seeps into the paper, but I do want the surface to be quite wet so we have more time to paint on it before it dries. Here I'm starting out with a medium consistency of Payne's Grey Bluish at the top. Then as I get towards the bottom, I'm going to add a little bit of sepia to create more of a neutral gray. And at the bottom, I added even more sepia, so the gray is even warmer. After applying the paint, I like to let the paint spread and even out. And once it's more or less evenly distributed, I'm going to use tissue that I've rolled up to absorb some of those paint. While doing this, I try to create circles as the negative shapes and play around with the size. You can see that the edges are kind of uneven, so to smooth it out, I'm just going to use a clean dry brush. After distributing a few of those negative circles, I'm going to increase the value for some areas. So I'm going to go back in with the Payne's Gray Bluish and paint in between those circles. I'm just applying it by tapping my brush because the surface is still pretty damp, so it's just going to travel on its own. Just like before, in terms of the color, I like to add in a bit of sepia into the Payne's Gray Bluish, especially at the bottom. When there are empty light areas, I like to draw out circles and paint around it. This will just add a different layer to the bokeh effect. I'm also doing this on a surface that's a little bit more dry, so the paint doesn't travel further than the area that I've applied it to. But if the area is too wet, you can't really do this because the paint will just travel and end up closing the circles that you just painted. This is why you'll see me adding the circles at the bottom area, because this part is a little bit more dry compared to the top area. Sometimes the paint will still travel and end up creating really weird edges. If that's the case, you can still take off the excess using tissue or a clean dry brush. So I would say that this is good practice to get a good feel of the dampness or dryness of the paper, because we have to really work with this in order to create the effect. After a while, the paper will look less glossy, and this means most of the water already seeped into the paper and is creating more of a damp surface, and some parts will always be a bit more damp than others, but once it's at the stage, I want to use the same mix, but with more sepia in the ratio to add some blurry branches in the background. You can use normal synthetic brush for this, but I've been trying to get used to my Chinese calligraphy brush because I really enjoy the dynamic strokes this creates, and it's really handy for painting branches. Sometimes if there are areas I want to fix or I don't like, I just cover it again with the same background color, and it doesn't really matter too much because we can always layer on more of those circles on top by taking off the paint with either tissue or a clean dry brush. In fact, it actually helps with the dynamic of the composition if some areas are darker than others. So yeah, the more I do this, the drier the surface would be, and at this stage for me, the paper is around 70 to 80% dry, and at this point, I'm just going to use this time to either paint more negative circles and also go over some of the previous layer to redefine them if they need some definition for those circles. For the areas with a darker background, I will just support the darker value by painting the negative circles with a thicker consistency and a lighter consistency for the lighter areas. And if some parts are still a touch damp and the paint is traveling too fast, sometimes it's much faster to stop the paint from traveling using tissue rather than a dry brush. So just try to use the tools according to your needs. At any point, you can also go back to paint on more branches if you would like, and I'm just using a light consistency so the lines stay nice and subtle. Since there's already a fair bit of circles painted on top of one another, I'm going to add some final circles with a cleaner edge using a thin consistency of bleed-proof white. So this time I'm actually painting on the circles instead of painting negative shapes, and having these circles with different edges, meaning some with cleaner defined edge as well as blurred ones, will help in creating the depth of the background. It's much easier to paint on the circles, so I'm going to add smaller ones and distribute them around the empty spaces, and also overlapping some of the larger circles to show off the contrast around the edges. Of course, you can still pair this up by adding more subtle negative circles, so there's a lot of going back and forth at this stage according to the stage that you're in with your background. Personally, if some of the blurry circles faded too much, I also like to re-outline those circles, then I just soften the blend using a clean damp brush. Once I'm happy with the bokeh background, I'm going to take off the masking fluid. But before you do this, make sure that the background is completely 100% dry, not even cold to the touch, or you might risk ripping the paper when you try to take it off. Next, I'm going to be painting the berries, And for the base color, I'm going to be using a mix of Winsor Red with a touch of New Gamboge to make it a little bit warmer and a bit more orangey. While painting on the berries, I want to leave a bit of negative space around the edge following the curvature of the oval. This will add a bit of a shininess to those berries and help with the round form. For the berry clumps, I like to separate the berries as I'm painting because I don't want them to touch when they're wet so the paint doesn't just blend into each other. So I like to jump around and paint the ones that are not touching each other, then dry them in between so I can paint the other berries which are behind or touching the previous ones that I just painted. For some of the berries which are placed behind the ones that I painted or the ones in front, I sometimes like to just darken it by adding a little bit of Payne's Gray Bluish into the Winsor Red. To add the round form, I'm going to layer a little bit of that darker red from the added Payne's Gray Bluish, and I'm just placing it at the bottom part of each berry or on the side if certain areas are covered by a berry in front. Now for the leaves, I'm going to use a mix of Payne's Gray Bluish with New Gamboge to create this muted green, and I'm just going to use it to paint the base color for all the leaves. I like to vary the values slightly and also the ratio if you want for a little bit of change in tone, so you can add more Payne's Gray Bluish or more New Gamboge depending on the tone that you're looking for. Sometimes I like to also do halves. So half of the leaf is a little bit darker than the other half. This will create an illusion of depth or folds to the leaves. Now let's add the leaf texture. I'm just going to use the medium consistency of the same mix, and I'm placing those angled lines on some of the lighter areas of the leaves. Since the rest of the leaves are fairly wet, I'm going to move on to paint the branches. For the color, I used what's left of the berry mix and I just added sepia with a little bit of Payne's Gray Bluish to make the color a bit more reddish and yet still dark and muted at the same time. You might also notice that I switched my calligraphy brush because just like before, I find that it's much easier to create more dynamic lines with this. But of course, you can still paint this with synthetic brushes, but for the smaller, finer lines, it might be easier to switch to smaller synthetic brushes for the branches, which attaches the berries and the leaves to the main branch. For the thin branches on the berries, I like to thicken the line and add a little bit of this triangular shape which attaches on top of the berries. This will just make it look a bit more natural and believable. After that, I'm going to go back to the leaves to add on some textures. This time I want to create a slightly different tone. So I'm mixing the mixture from the branch to the green mixture from New Gamboge and Payne's Gray Bluish, and this will just create a warmer green and a slightly darker tone. I use the thin to medium consistency of this to paint the midrib very finely and also some veins for some of the leaves. Once I'm done adding the details, I'm going to use the same New Gamboge and Payne's Gray Bluish mix, but this time it has a little bit more Payne's Gray Bluish in the ratio, so the color is a bit cooler, and I'm adding some rough textures around the edges of the leaves, and I like to also go over certain areas using this color to create a bit of variation. For the ends of the berries, I decided to add a little bit of finer details by adding those spiky bits. I'm not sure what they're called, but for the color, I just use the red berry mixture with added Payne's Gray Bluish as well as sepia to create this really rich and dark tone. Then I use the tip of my brush to paint those pointy bits. And last but not least, I'm going to add on those frosty bits around the branches, the leaves, as well as the berries. I quite like the look of the berries as is, so you can leave it like this and call it a completed painting. But for me, since the background has this nice bokeh texture and the color is quite cool and grayish, the circles end up looking like bokeh snow. And to support the winter feel of the overall painting, I decided to add the frost. I just use a very thick consistency of bleed-proof white, and I use a dry brush load in order to get those rough textures. At the beginning, I used the Chinese calligraphy brush. Even though I like the texture, I felt like it took too long since the bristles are a bit too flimsy for this. If you have a synthetic brush that is a little bit frayed, I feel like that would work well. Or just like me, you can use a small brush and a light to dry brush load to dot in the textures. I want the frost to accumulate around the edges of the berries as well as the leaves, so I'm making those dots much more dense in those areas, and as I get towards the center of the berries or the leaves, I made the dots a little bit more sparse. I want to depict some frost buildup on some of the berries or the leaves, and for those areas, I added thin lines facing outwards on top of the dots that I've already painted. After adding on the whites, I felt like it has flattened the painting a bit too much, so I'm going to build on the darker values for the leaves by using Payne's Grey Bluish with a bit of new Gamboge, and you can also add sepia to mute the color further if you would like. For the darker tones, I like to place it closer to the bottom of the leaves where the branch is connecting to the leaves, but sometimes I like to also extend it all the way up the midrib, and this will just create different variations of the leaves. I'm also going to darken parts of the berries as well to exaggerate the contrast. And for the color, I use a mix of Payne's Grey Bluish, a bit of sepia, and Winsor Red. I'm also going to darken the branches, at least the main branch and some of the larger branches attaching to parts of the leaves, using the same dark red mix with added sepia. At this point, I felt like I'm done, but in actuality, I ended up adding a bit more details afterwards, but for now, I'm just going to unmask the sides. I actually felt like the branch looks kind of flat because it's only one tone, so I wanted to add a bit of highlights in the middle to give a bit of dimension, but instead of going over the sides using a darker brown, I ended up just using a light consistency of bleed-proof white to line some of the center of the main branches instead. I'm also going to use what's left of the thin consistency bleed-proof white on my brush to add some more subtle light frost lines. And that's basically it for this painting. If you enjoyed this tutorial and would like to see more like this, please consider subscribing. Like usual, the list of tools as well as my social media links will be in my description box. If you guys are still here, thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you guys at the next one. Bye!